The sea was a restless teacher. Some days it whispered, other days it roared, but it never stayed silent for long. For her, silence was found only in the pages of her journal, a worn, leather-bound book she carried like a second skin. Its edges were softened from years of use, the ink inside smudged where salt water had kissed the paper. She guarded it carefully, though not out of vanity. It was less possession than lifeline. While the crew drank, laughed, and swapped exaggerated tales of ports visited and storms braved, she sat cross-legged in a quiet corner of the deck, her quill scratching softly against parchment. Every detail mattered to her: the tilt of the mast when the wind changed, the sudden disappearance of seabirds, the way a wave crested slightly higher than its brothers. To others, these were nuisances or meaningless observations. To her, they were patterns, signals, pieces of a larger puzzle the sea had laid before them. The men, hardened sailors of all ages, found her habit strange. At first, they tolerated it with mild amusement, whispering about the odd girl who wrote more than she spoke. But amusement soon turned to mockery. They nicknamed her the scribe, not with admiration but derision, as though writing were weakness in a world ruled by strength and muscle. "Careful, lads," one of them would call, slapping his comrade on the back as she scribbled. "Best not sneeze too loud. She'll write it down and make it sound like a storm." The laughter that followed was loud and merciless. She would glance up briefly, lips pressed into a thin line, then return to her work. Her pen never wavered. Mockery turned meaner with time. Men would shuffle past her and pretend to scratch invisible pens on invisible pages, bending low to mimic her hunched posture. Others would mutter exaggerated nonsense when she opened her journal, whispering things like, "The gull sneezed at dawn surely, that means the end is near." The louder the laughter grew, the deeper the sting sank into her chest. Yet she never defended herself. She did not beg them to understand, nor explain what she saw in the waves, the clouds, the air itself. She had long learned that truth did not need defense. It needed patience. So she let her ink hold the answers instead. Still, she was human. The sting of their laughter weighed heavily in her heart, and sometimes, late at night, when only the lantern beside her swayed with the ship's rocking, she would pause mid-sentence and let her quill hover above the page. The words in her mind pressed forward, eager to be captured, yet her hand hesitated. Was it foolish to keep writing when no one cared? Was it vanity, to think her observations mattered when seasoned sailors dismissed them as child's play? She would close her eyes then, remembering the first journal she had ever filled, years ago before she joined the voyage. She had been barely a girl, watching storms roll in from a small coastal village. While others ran for shelter, she would stand on the shore, hair whipped by the wind, scribbling down the patterns of the clouds. One storm had struck exactly as she predicted, her father's boat narrowly escaping ruin because she had insisted he return before sundown. That memory had been enough to keep her writing all these years, enough to remind her that what others mocked could still hold truth. The ship itself was no easy home for her. It was a living beast, creaking and groaning, its boards soaked in salt and sweat. The air always carried a tang of brine, mixed with the sharper smell of unwashed bodies and tar. She learned quickly to steady herself against the endless rocking, her journal balanced on her knees even in the roughest waters. Where others cursed the sea, she studied it. The ship may have belonged to the captain, but the sea, it belonged to no one, and she wanted to understand it. The captain, a stoic man with a face carved by wind and sun, rarely acknowledged her. He commanded with a voice like gravel, and his men obeyed without hesitation. He was not unkind, but he was not patient either. Discipline and order were his virtues, and he had little use for soft words or untested ideas. To him, her presence on the voyage was tolerated, not valued. She had earned her place not through trust, but through persistence, offering her services as a recorder of cargo and trade. The journal, in his eyes, was meant for ledgers, not for the wild musings she filled it with. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, and the deck glowed with the orange fire of twilight, the men's laughter turned sharper than usual. She had been writing furiously, noting the subtle shift in the wind, when one of the younger sailors, emboldened by the attention of his mates, snatched the journal from her lap. "Let's see what secrets the scribe keeps from us," he shouted, dodging as she lunged forward, her eyes flashing with panic. The crew gathered, jeering as the boy flipped through the pages. His expression shifted from glee to confusion as he read aloud. Gulls flying lower than usual, clouds dense though stars are clear, currents pushing east against the wind. He squinted. "What is this drivel?" Another sailor snatched the journal from him, scanning the pages before tossing it back to her with a scoff. "This isn't worth ink. You'd better hope the captain never sees how much paper you waste." Her hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest. The laughter rang in her ears long after the men dispersed. Alone, she returned to her corner, the lantern light catching the wetness in her eyes. She wiped them quickly, unwilling to give the sea or the men the satisfaction of seeing her break. That night, she wrote anyway. The page absorbed her pain, her defiance, her unshakable conviction. The words came faster than ever, as though the sea itself demanded to be transcribed. She wrote about the faint electric tingle in the air, about the unnatural stillness beneath the waves, about the instinctive unease prickling at her skin. Something was coming. She didn't know what, but she knew the signs. When she finally set her quill down, the ship was dark, except for her single lantern. She pressed her palm flat against the journal's cover, as if sealing the truth inside. One day, she told herself, they would see. One day, the sea would speak through her pages, and laughter would not be enough to drown it. And though she did not know it then, that day was closer than anyone expected. The sea had its own rhythm-endless waves, rolling like a heartbeat, but the crew's laughter cut through it harshly, sharp as a blade. Their mockery had become ritual now, a cruel pastime to ease the monotony of endless days at sea. She had learned to brace herself for it, the same way she braced against a sudden swell. They mocked the way her head bent over her journal, how her hand never seemed to rest. They called her the chronicler of nonsense, storm whisperer, or worse, names that stung like salt in an open wound. She never answered back. To reply would be to grant them victory. So instead, she pressed her lips together, steadied her hand, and continued writing. But the silence that once shielded her now seemed to provoke them further. The more she ignored them, the bolder they became. One morning, as the ship cut steadily across calm waters, a group of sailors cornered her near the bow. She had been sketching the strange ripple patterns in the sea lines that moved against the wind when they loomed above her like shadows. "Tell us, scribe," one of them jeered. "What do your holy pages say today? Will a fish sneeze and sink us? Will the clouds spell out doom?" The men erupted in laughter, slapping each other's backs, their voices carrying across the deck. She closed her journal carefully, holding it tight to her chest as though it were armor. Another sailor bent down, peering mockingly into her eyes. "Maybe she's writing love letters to the ocean." No man would put up with a woman who only stares at waves. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her expression stayed still, her eyes hard. The men wanted her to break. She would not. They grew bolder. One snatched her quill and pretended to scribble in the air. "Look, lads, on the great prophetess of gulls." 3 gulls flew east, so surely a storm is near. The others roared with laughter, doubling over. Her fists clenched around her journal. A part of her longed to scream, to snatch back the quill, and remind them of the storm she had once predicted on her village's coast, the storm that had nearly taken her father's life. But no words left her lips. Instead, she turned and walked away, her steps measured, her dignity intact, even as laughter followed her like a curse. That night, the cruelty deepened. The crew had gathered near the galley, their voices carrying through the hall as she sat alone with her lantern. One of them mimicked her hunched posture, pretending to scrawl furiously on a plank of wood. Another added exaggerated whispers. The stars blinked twice surely. The gods are angry. Their laughter was louder than the crash of the waves. She pressed her hand against the journal, her chest tight. Her quill trembled in her grip, ink blotting the page. For a moment, doubt clawed at her heart. What if they were right? What if her observations were meaningless? What if the sea's signs were nothing more than tricks of her imagination? But then she remembered. The storm years ago. The way her notes had saved her father's boat. The way patterns repeated themselves, if one only looked closely enough. The sea spoke, but not everyone listened. She could not stop writing now, not when silence would mean blindness. Still, the ridicule wore at her like waves wearing stone. She began to write at odd hours, sneaking to the deck when the others slept. The lantern's glow became her only companion, her journal filling with thoughts too delicate to survive their laughter. She wrote about the way the moonlight touched the waves, the faint scent of rain carried on distant winds, the sudden silence of seabirds before dawn. Yet the harder she tried to hide, the more determined they became to break her. One evening, as the crew drank their ration of rum, one sailor stumbled toward her, his face flushed red. Without warning, he snatched her journal from her lap. "Enough of your scribbles," he slurred, waving the book high above his head. "Let's see what foolish prophecy she writes tonight." She leapt to her feet, panic rising like fire in her throat. "Give it back," she demanded, her voice sharp with urgency. The crew roared with laughter at her sudden outburst. The sailor flipped the book open, squinting at the cramped handwriting. "Listen to this," he bellowed. "The air is heavy tonight, though the sky is clear. The gulls have not returned, and the sea is restless. What nonsense is this?" He turned another page, mocking her tone. "If the tides continue eastward, I suspect a storm within 3 days. A storm. Ha! The skies are clear, the winds gentle. Does this sound like doom to you, lads?" The men jeered, clapping, shouting insults. Another sailor grabbed the book, waving it around like a prize. She lunged forward, desperation breaking through her calm. "Please give it back." For a moment, she feared they would tear the journal apart. Her heart raced, her mind screamed. That book was more than paper and ink. It was her life, her proof, her voice in a world that refused to hear her. At last, one of the older sailors, gruff and weary, growled at the others. "Enough. Give the girl her book before you bring bad luck on us all." The laughter faltered. The journal was tossed back at her carelessly, its leather cover smacking against her chest. She clutched it tight, relief flooding her even as humiliation burned her cheeks. The men returned to their rum and songs, their amusement spent for the night. She retreated to the shadows, her hands shaking. She opened the journal to check for damage, tracing each page as though reassuring herself it still breathed. Then, slowly, her quill found the paper again. "They mock what they do not understand," she wrote, her hands steadier with each word. "But the sea is changing. The signs are too clear to ignore. If they will not listen now, they will listen when the storm comes." Her eyes lifted to the dark horizon. The wind had shifted again, subtle but undeniable. She felt it in her bones, in the restless pitch of the sea. A storm was indeed coming sooner than any of them realized. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. Their cruelty cut deep, but she would endure it. Because when the sea finally revealed its teeth, it would not be their laughter that mattered. It would be her words. And though they didn't know it yet, their survival would soon depend on the very pages they scorned. The days after the incident with her journal passed in uneasy silence. The crew's laughter softened, not out of guilt, but boredom. They had wrung as much amusement from her scribbles as they could. For now, she was left in peace. Yet peace on a ship was fragile, as fleeting as calm seas before a storm. She continued writing, though more cautiously. The quill whispered across the page in stolen moments, her lantern flickering against the salt-stained wood. She wrote of the gulls that had not returned, of the restless tide pushing against the wind, of the heavy feeling in the air. The pattern was building towards something inevitable. She could feel it, like a tightening knot in her chest. On the third evening, the captain took notice. Captain Thorne was a man carved by the sea itself, broad-shouldered, his face weathered like driftwood, his eyes sharp as flint. He walked the deck with the authority of a man who had seen storms break lesser men. The crew respected him with an almost superstitious fear. His word was law, his silence heavier than chains. He rarely spared her more than a glance. To him, she was a tolerated passenger, useful enough to tally cargo and provisions, but not worth his time beyond that. Yet on this particular evening, as twilight bled into the horizon, something caught his attention. She sat alone near the stern, murmuring softly to herself as she wrote. Her lips moved in rhythm with her quill. Gulls absent. Wind opposing current. Air thick though sky clear. The captain paused mid-stride, his ears catching the words. He frowned, his instincts pricked. Years at sea had taught him that the ocean always gave warnings, subtle though they were. He had learned to watch the sky, the birds, the smell of the air. And though he would never admit it aloud, her muttering echoed things he himself had noticed. He approached quietly, his boots thudding against the planks. The crew, scattered across the deck, fell hushed as they saw him halt behind her. She, absorbed in her notes, did not notice until his shadow fell across the page. "Read it aloud," he said. Her quill froze. She looked up, startled, into the captain's stern face. For a heartbeat, her chest tightened. Was this the moment he confiscated her journal? Would he forbid her from writing, deeming it a distraction? It's nothing, Captain, she murmured, clutching the journal slightly tighter. Just observations, his gaze hardened. Then read it. The silence of the crew thickened. Sailors leaned closer, eyes wide, eager to see her humiliated. Some smirked, expecting the captain's wrath to fall on her scribbles. Hands trembling slightly, she obeyed. Her voice was soft but steady as she read. The gulls have not returned to the mast since dawn. The tide presses east, though the wind blows steady west. The clouds thicken high above, though stars remain clear. The sea rolls heavier, each wave striking harder than the last. I suspect a storm within 3 nights, though no sign yet stains the horizon. When she finished, the deck was silent. The crew waited for the captain's laugh, his scolding dismissal. But no such sound came. Instead, Captain Thorne extended his hand. "Give me the journal," he said. Her breath caught. Slowly, reluctantly, she placed the book in his calloused palm. He opened it, flipping past pages of dense writing and sketches, detailed drawings of cloud formations, wave patterns, even bird flight paths. His brows furrowed as he read, his thumb tracing a line of ink where she had noted a shift in current 2 weeks ago, something he himself had felt, but never spoken aloud. The crew shuffled uneasily. Never had they seen the captain linger over anything that wasn't a map, a compass, or a logbook. Minutes passed. The captain read in silence, his face unreadable. Each page he turned seemed to weigh heavier. Finally, he closed the journal with a quiet thud. He looked at her, not with mockery, not with dismissal, but with something far more dangerous. Respect mixed with unease. "You wrote this yourself?" he asked. "Yes, Captain," she replied, her voice firmer now. He studied her a long moment, then returned the journal. His hand lingered on the cover before releasing it. "You keep writing. Everything. No detail left out. Do you understand?" The words struck the crew harder than a gale. Their smirks faded, replaced by confusion. Their captain, had not only taken her journal seriously, but had ordered her continue. She nodded, clutching the book to her chest. "Yes, Captain." Without another word, he turned and strode away, his coat whipping in the wind. The crew parted before him, whispering in disbelief. No laughter followed this time. Only silence. That night, she could hardly write for the trembling of her hands, not from fear, but from the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time since stepping aboard, someone had listened. Someone had seen the truth in her words. And not just anyone, the captain himself. She opened the journal, dipping her quill into ink. Her hand steadied as she began a new entry. "Tonight, the captain read my words." He did not laugh. He saw. Perhaps now the sea will have another listener. Outside, the wind whispered across the sails, carrying with it the scent of rain. The storm was coming. She knew it. Now, at last, she was not alone in that knowledge. But she also knew this. The captain's silence after reading her journal was not born of doubt. It was born of recognition. He had seen something in her pages that confirmed his own fears. And if Captain Thorne was silent, it meant the danger ahead was greater than any of them imagined. The crew slept uneasily that night, though few admitted it. Some muttered that the captain's interest in her scribbles was a passing whim. Others whispered of omens and bad luck. But none dared mock her openly, again. Not when the captain himself had gone silent before her words. And so the ship sailed on, its course steady, its crew restless. The sea rolled beneath them, vast and dark, as if holding its breath. In her journal, she wrote until her eyes grew heavy. Sketches of clouds, notes on the wind, thoughts half finished but urgent. She felt the storm pressing closer, like a shadow at the edge of vision. For the first time, she allowed herself a small, secret smile. The laughter was over. The listening had begun. And soon, the sea would prove her right. The sea stretched endlessly under a moonlit sky, silver light rippling across the waves like shards of broken glass. The ship creaked and groaned with its steady rhythm, the sails filled with a wind that hummed through the rigging. On that night, Captain Thorne remained on deck long after his men had turned in, the journal heavy in his hand. He had taken it without a word, as though it belonged not to her, but to the ship itself. The crew, unsure whether to be curious or fearful, watched from a distance before finally retreating to their hammocks. Only she lingered nearby, hands clenched at her sides, her stomach twisting with dread. Would he mock her after all, in private? Or worse, would he forbid her from writing again? The captain stood near the lantern by the mainmast, flipping carefully through the pages. His weathered brow furrowed as he traced lines of neat script, sketches of waves curling in strange angles, diagrams of cloud layers stacked upon one another. His fingers lingered on certain notes, as if confirming something against his own memory of past voyages. At last, he spoke without looking up. "You have been keeping this since the beginning of the voyage?" "Yes, Captain," she said quietly. "And before, in other journeys?" He grunted, a sound neither approving nor dismissive, and turned another page. "These sketches of the currents. You drew them by memory?" "I watching," she replied. "The water speaks if you look long enough." His eyes flicked up to hers, sharp as a hawk's. "Water doesn't speak." "Sailors do." For a heartbeat, her courage faltered. But then she lifted her chin. "With respect, Captain, the sea always speaks. Most just choose not to hear it." Silence followed. Then, to her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched something dangerously close to a smile, though fleeting. He closed the journal with a firm snap. "You'll meet me here tomorrow at dawn," he said. "Bring the journal. I want to hear more of what the sea has been whispering to you." He walked away, leaving her breathless, her heart hammering. The next morning, the crew gathered sluggishly at their duties, eyes darting toward her as she stood beside the captain at the stern. The journal lay open across a barrel, her finger tracing notes she had written days before. "Here," she said, pointing to a passage. "2 nights ago, the gulls circled low, close to the water. That means the air pressure was dropping." The captain grunted in acknowledgement. "And here," she continued, flipping to a page covered in wave sketches. "The current ran counter to the wind. That always means unsettled waters, sometimes storms." Some of the sailors exchanged uneasy looks. They remembered that night, the strange push of the tide beneath their feet. The captain leaned over the book, his finger tapping one of her sketches. "This you drew from memory?" "Yes." The waves were taller on the starboard side, shorter on the port. It meant the swell was coming from a different direction than the wind. The ocean was warning us. The captain's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I've seen it before." Few notice. For the first time, he looked at her not as a burden, but as a fellow seafarer. By midday, whispers rippled through the crew. Some scoffed, saying the captain humored her out of boredom. Others frowned, unease etched into their faces. Superstition ran deep in sailors' blood, and though they mocked her before, seeing their captain bent over her journal unsettled them. That night, she wrote again, her lantern glowing like a star in the darkness. But this time, she was not alone. A captain stood at the railing nearby, pretending to study the horizon. His presence was not intrusive, it was permission. For the first time, she felt her words mattered to someone who commanded more than laughter. Her entry that night was longer, her hand moving with urgency. The air grows heavier by the hour. The stars blur at their edges, though no clouds veil them yet. The waves strike harder, with a hidden strength beneath their surface. "The storm I feared is nearly here. I believe it will break within 2 days." She shut the journal and stared at the horizon. The night was deceptively calm, the sky scattered with stars. But her bones knew better. The following morning, Captain Thorne gathered his officers in the chart room. Maps sprawled across the table, compasses and dividers scattered like weapons. And there, beside them, lay her journal. "She claims a storm is coming," Thorne said, his tone flat but heavy. The first mate scoffed. "With respect, Captain, the skies are clear. The wind is steady. We've seen no sign of weather." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "And yet the swells are heavier. The currents run strange. Did you not feel the drag beneath the hull last night?" The mate hesitated, glancing at the others. A few nodded reluctantly. "Her notes match what I've observed," Thorne continued. He tapped the journal. "She has tracked things most of us overlook. Signs we've grown too proud to heed. I'll not dismiss it." The room fell silent. To question the captain was folly, yet unease lingered. The idea of trusting a woman's scribbles over years of hardened seamanship gnawed at their pride. When the meeting ended, the officers left in grim silence, but the journal remained on the table, its presence undeniable. That evening, the crew gathered around their supper, voices low and wary. No one dared mock her now, not openly. The memory of the captain, standing over her journal, lingered like a shadow. Some muttered she was a witch, reading omens in the sea. Others whispered she was blessed, a seer of storms. She sat apart, her bowl untouched, listening. Their words no longer cut her as they once had. They feared her now, and fear was sharper than laughter. But she feared too not their whispers, but the storm itself. She felt it in her blood, the way one feels the pressure drop before rain, the heaviness that pulls at the lungs. The sea was holding its breath, and soon it would exhale with fury. That night, the captain approached her where she sat with her journal. He leaned against the railing, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he said, "why do you write it all down? Why not simply keep it in your head?" She looked down at the book in her lap, fingers tracing the warm leather. "Because the sea is vast, Captain. Bigger than memory, bigger than thought. If I keep it here," she tapped the cover, "I can see the patterns. The sea tells its story in pieces, and the journal stitches them together." He studied her a long moment before nodding. "Then keep stitching. We may need that story soon." With that, he turned and left, his coat billowing behind him. She stared after him, the weight of his words sinking deep. We may need that story soon. For the first time since stepping aboard, she was not merely tolerated. She was needed. And as she opened her journal once more, her hand steady against the trembling ship, she knew the truth. The storm would come, and when it did, the pages of her book would be the difference between survival and ruin. The first sign came with the gulls. For 3 days, the horizon had been strangely empty, the birds that usually trailed the ship vanishing, as if they sensed something the men could not. The crew muttered superstitions under their breath, crossing themselves or spitting into the sea for luck. Even the most skeptical among them grew uneasy when the skies remained too clear, the air too heavy. It was as if the ocean itself was waiting, biding its time. By dusk, the wind began to shift. It came sudden and sharp, cutting across the deck with a force that snapped lantern flames sideways. The sails groaned as they caught the gusts. The ropes, straining like the ship itself, resisted some invisible pull. She stood near the stern, journal clutched to her chest, heart pounding. Every word she had written over the past days whispered back at her now. The sea was restless. The swells were wrong. The air pressed down like a heavy hand. The storm was here. "Captain!" The lookout cried from the crow's nest. Clouds to the west. Every head snapped up. On the horizon, where only a thin band of orange should have marked the setting sun, a wall of black was rising. It rolled forward like a living beast, swallowing the sky. Forks of lightning cracked within it, silent at first, but terrifying in their scale. The crew froze. Then panic broke. Men shouted, scrambling across the deck, tugging ropes and shouting over each other. "Reef the sails!" The first mate bellowed, but his voice was drowned by the howl of the wind, which rose in a sudden roar, tugging at coats, tearing at hats, whipping hair into faces. The sea, so deceptively calm before, heaved upward, waves building beneath the ship with violent force. The captain's voice thundered across the chaos. "Hold fast. Secure the lines, move." Yet even his commands barely cut through the storm's growing voice. The ship tilted sharply as a wave struck its side, sending men tumbling. Barrels rolled across the deck, smashing into the railings. The smell of rain thickened, sharp and metallic, moments before the sky opened in a downpour. She clung to the railing, her journal pressed tight against her chest, ink smearing where the rain struck its cover. Fear clawed at her throat, but another voice stronger, steadier rose within her. The journal. The entries. She had written this storm before it arrived, mapped it out in words and ink. She knew what to do. The captain's eyes found her through the chaos. In 2 strides, he was at her side, his hand gripping her arm. Rain streamed down his face, his voice a low growl against the wind. "Your journal," he barked. "What does it say?" She blinked against the rain, breath ragged. "Reef the mainsail." Don't fight the wind turn with it. Head east, not west. His gaze locked with hers, hard and searching, and he shouted to the crew, "Reef the mainsail. Shift east, now." The men hesitated only a second before obeying. The captain's authority was unquestioned, even in madness. Ropes groaned as sailors wrestled with the sails, their hands bleeding against wet hemp. The ship groaned as it turned, fighting the waves, but slowly, agonizingly, it shifted course. A wall of water rose ahead, higher than the mast. The crew cried out, some falling to their knees, others bracing themselves against the railings. She clutched the captain's coat, heart hammering as the wave crashed over them. For a moment, the world was nothing but water and fury. But the ship held. It shook, shuddered, creaked as though it would split apart, but it held. Soaked, coughing, the men staggered back to their posts. A captain roared more orders, his voice carrying with newfound clarity. But each command traced back to her words, her journal. He kept glancing at her, demanding more, as if the storm itself was written in her ink. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling, smudged ink blurring her notes. Brace the starboard side. The swell is rolling from the south. You'll lose men if they stay there. The captain repeated it at once, and the men obeyed, dragging themselves to the safer side of the ship, just as another monstrous wave struck. Had they been standing where they were, the sea would have taken them. Hours passed like this chaos and survival, the storm hammering them mercilessly. Lightning tore open the sky, thunder boomed so loud it rattled their bones, and the rain never ceased. The ocean rose and fell with impossible violence, tossing the ship like a toy. And through it all, her journal guided them. Each page, each scribbled note, became a lifeline. What once had been laughter on their lips was now the only thing keeping them alive. At one point, a younger sailor, terrified and near breaking, stumbled toward her. His eyes were wide, his voice cracked with desperation. "Tell us what to do. Please tell us." She wanted to weep then, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of it all. These men who mocked her, who tore her heart with ridicule, now clung to her words as though they were scripture. Her voice steadied. "Hold the lines, keep your backs to the mast, and do not let go. The sea will try to take you, but you hold fast. The storm will pass. It always passes." The boy nodded, tears mingling with rain, and returned to his post with a determination she had not seen before. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the storm began to ease. The waves, though still monstrous, lost some of their fury. The wind, once a screaming banshee, softened to a heavy howl. The lightning grew distant, the thunder fading to a grumble. Dawn broke weakly through the clouds, pale light spilling across a battered but intact ship. The deck was littered with broken ropes, smashed barrels, and exhausted men sprawled wherever they could breathe. But they were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. The captain stood at the helm, soaked to the bone, his face carved in grim lines. His hand still clutched the railing, knuckles white. Slowly, he turned to her, his eyes unreadable. Then, with a solemn nod, he said the words none of the crew could have imagined. "You saved us." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Every sailor on deck, battered and bruised, turned their eyes to her. Not with mockery, not with ridicule, but with respect, the raw, undeniable kind that could not be faked. She held her journal close, its pages warped with rain, the ink smudged but still legible. A faint, tired smile touched her lips. "No, Captain," she whispered. "The sea saved us. I only listened." And for the first time, the crew understood. Morning broke like a fragile promise. The storm had passed, but its memory still lingered in every groan of timber, and every battered face. The sea, though calmer, was far from gentle. Swells still rolled beneath the ship, rocking it like a cradle, but compared to the madness of the night before, the movement felt almost merciful. The crew emerged slowly, like survivors from a wreckage. Their clothes clung to them in damp folds, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Salt stung in every cut and bruise, their hands raw from rope burns. Silence reigned over the deck, a silence so heavy that even the gulls, now circling once more above them, seemed subdued. She stood near the stern, her journal clutched to her chest as though it were a relic. Its leather cover was warped and swollen, its pages buckled from the rain. Yet the words still remained. Some smudged, others blurred, but the record of the storm was there. Proof that she had seen what others had missed. Proof that she had been right. No one laughed now. No one dared. Captain Thorne moved among his men, his gait slow but steady. He checked ropes, examined the sails, barked quiet orders to repair damage. But even his voice seemed altered lower, graver, touched with something the crew had never heard before. Respect, perhaps, or humility. When his eyes met hers, he gave the faintest of nods. That single gesture carried more weight than any speech. The men saw it too. The nod was permission. It was acknowledgement. It was an unspoken decree. She was no longer to be mocked. By midday, they had managed to clear the worst of the wreckage. Broken barrels had been hauled away, torn sails patched crudely, fallen rigging secured. The men moved slower than usual, but they moved with purpose. As they worked, their glances flicked often toward her. Some looked away quickly, ashamed of their past words. Others stared longer, curiosity etched on their faces. Not one of them smirked. Not one of them laughed. At supper, the crew gathered in the mess hall, bowls of thin stew in their hands. The storm had ruined much of their provisions, and the food was meager, but no one complained. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. Then one of the younger sailors, the same boy who had begged her for guidance during the storm, rose to his feet. His voice trembled at first, then steadied. "To the lady with the journal," he said, lifting his bowl. "Had she not written what she did, we'd be lying at the bottom of the sea. I'll not forget it." The hall went still. One by one, the others lifted their bowls as well. Rough hands, scarred and weary, raised their meager suppers in salute. No words were spoken, but the gesture was enough. It was a silent vow, a collective acknowledgement. She felt her throat tighten. For so long, her journal had been nothing but a source of mockery. Now it was her shield, her proof, her voice. She raised her own bowl in return, whispering softly, "To the sea that spares us." The crew drank deeply, and in that moment, the last of the old laughter died. Later that night, she returned to the deck, her lantern glowing softly against the darkness. She opened her journal, smoothing its warped pages, and began to write. The storm has passed. The men are silent, as though struck by something greater than fear. I have never seen them look at me so. They do not mock. They do not jest. They see me now, perhaps for the first time. Yet I wonder if they see me, or only the storm that spared them. Her pen hesitated. She glanced at the captain, who stood at the helm, his figure outlined against the moonlight. He had not spoken much since dawn, but his silence carried weight. It was not avoidance. It was contemplation. She dipped her pen again. The captain does not laugh either, but in his silence there is no mockery, only thought. Perhaps he, too, writes a journal in his mind. Perhaps he stitches the sea together in his own way. I wonder if he will ever let me read it. She closed the book, hugging it to her chest. In the following days, the ship limped eastward. Repairs continued, food was rationed carefully, and the sea slowly calmed to its familiar rhythm. Yet something had undeniably changed aboard. Where once the men had filled the air with crude jokes and bawdy songs, now their voices were quieter. They spoke in low tones, worked with unusual diligence, and cast frequent glances at her as if expecting her to speak again. They had survived, yes, but survival carried its own burden. To live when death had seemed certain left a scar deeper than any wound. And she had become, unwillingly, the keeper of that scar. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Captain Thorne approached her. His expression was unreadable, as always, but his eyes were sharper than usual. "You kept us afloat," he said plainly. She shook her head. "I only wrote what I saw." "And I only gave the orders," he replied. "But orders mean nothing if they are wrong. And words mean nothing if no one listens. Yet here we are alive. You and I both know why." She met his gaze, searching for mockery, but found none. "What will you do with it?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "Do with what?" "The journal. Those words. You have written something no sailor would dare speak, warnings, patterns, truths of the sea. Will you keep them only for yourself? Or will you let them live beyond these pages?" Her breath caught. She had never considered it. The journal had always been personal, a shield against loneliness, a way to make sense of the chaos. But to share it? To make it more than her private world? "I don't know," she admitted softly. The captain nodded once, as though that was answer enough. He turned to leave, then paused. "Think on it. The sea doesn't whisper to many, but it whispers to you. That's a gift. And gifts unused have a way of turning into curses." With that, he walked away, leaving her with her thoughts and her trembling hands on the leather-bound cover. That night, the crew slept soundly for the first time in days. The storm's memory lingered, but so did relief. And yet, for her, sleep would not come. She lay awake in her hammock, staring at the beams above, listening to the creak of the ship and the distant rush of waves. The captain's words echoed in her mind. "What will you do with it?" The journal lay beside her, heavy with meaning. She reached out, brushing her fingers against it, as though it might answer for her. But it remained silent. The sea did not always give easy answers. And so, as dawn crept over the horizon, she rose, took her journal in hand, and stepped onto the deck once more. The storm had left them battered, but alive. The laughter had died, but something new had been born in its place. Respect, yes. Fear, perhaps, but also something rarer possibility. And though she did not yet know what she would do with it, she knew this. The story of the sea, as told in her pages, was far from finished. The days after the storm unfolded with a strange quiet. The sea had returned to its rhythm-rolling swells, shifting winds, the familiar cries of gulls overhead, but the men were not the same. Something about surviving that night had carved a hollowness into them, and in its place had grown a careful reverence. No one mocked her anymore. In fact, when she moved about the deck, men stepped aside without thought. When she sat with her journal, no one leaned over to sneer or mimic. Instead, they pretended not to watch, though their eyes lingered. It was as if they feared to break a fragile spell. Even laughter, once their constant companion, had become rare. Songs were sung in softer voices, jokes shared in private tones. The storm had stripped them of arrogance, and in its place left humility and caution. And in the center of that silence, she found herself no longer invisible. One morning, as the pale light of dawn spilled across the deck, Captain Thorne called her to the helm. A chart lay spread out across the barrel before him, his finger tapping a line along the coastline. "We're short on supplies," he said, his voice low but firm. We'll need to make port sooner than expected. The nearest harbor is 3 days east, but the currents here are unpredictable." He glanced at her, his sharp eyes unreadable. "Your journal mentions them." "Show me." Her hands trembled slightly as she laid the book beside the chart. She flipped through warped pages until she found the entry sketches of waves curling at sharp angles, notes on tides that shifted with the moon's pull. "There," she said, pointing to her drawing. "The current runs strongest at dawn, east to west. If you fight it, you'll waste time and provisions. But if you sail with it, then turn north when the gulls begin circling, you'll catch the winds back toward shore." The captain studied her words, then the chart, then her again. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he turned to his first mate. "Adjust course," Thorne ordered. "We'll follow her notes." The mate hesitated, his mouth tightening, but he obeyed. Orders were orders. And just like that, the journal was no longer a curiosity, it was part of their navigation. By midday, the crew knew. Sailors talked, as sailors always did, and word spread that the captain had turned the ship on her guidance. Some muttered uneasily, others nodded with grim acceptance. That evening, as she sat with her journal, one of the older sailors, a broad-shouldered man with scars across his face, approached her. For a moment, she thought he had come to mock again. But instead, he shifted awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "You wrote about that storm," he muttered. "Said it would come, and it did. And now you've got the captain steering on your notes." She looked up warily. "Do you disapprove?" He shook his head. "No, just never thought I'd see the day when a book saved my skin. Guess I owe you thanks." Before she could reply, he walked away, leaving her stunned. Thanks. The word echoed in her mind, strange and new. As the days wore on, her role solidified. Each morning, the captain asked for her observations. Each evening, she recorded them with fresh ink, her lantern flickering beside her. The journal had become more than her private refuge. It was now part of the ship's survival. The men no longer called her strange. They began calling her something else, navigator. The title spread quietly, whispered at first, then spoken more openly. It was never official. The ship had its officers, and hierarchy was tradition. But when storms threatened or winds shifted, the men sought her eyes. They trusted her words. And though she never demanded it, the name filled her with a sense she had long been denied, belonging. One evening, Captain Thorne lingered beside her as she wrote. The lantern light caught the lines of his weathered face, the salt of his beard, the exhaustion in his eyes. Yet his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You've done more than I expected," he admitted. "When I first saw you writing, I thought it was vanity, a distraction. But I was wrong." She looked up, surprised. "You were willing to listen." He gave a faint, wry smile. "A captain who doesn't listen to his crew doesn't last long. The sea has a way of humbling men who think they know better. It humbled me, and it showed me you." Her cheeks warmed at the words, though she hid it by glancing back at her journal. "It wasn't me. It was the sea. I only write what it tells me." "Then you hear it better than most," he replied. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. For once, she felt equal, her presence not as an oddity, but as part of the ship's heartbeat. But not all were so willing to yield. The first mate, a man hardened by years of service, grew colder with each passing day. He followed orders, yes, but his jaw tightened whenever the captain sought her counsel. His pride was wounded, his authority undermined. One evening, as the crew ate in silence, he slammed his bowl onto the table. "Since when does this ship take orders from ink and paper?" He growled. "We've sailed these waters for years without needing a woman's scribbles. Now suddenly, we can't tie a rope without consulting her book?" The room went still. All eyes turned to her. Her heart pounded, but before she could answer, the young sailor who once begged her for guidance during the storm spoke up. His voice shook, but it carried. "Without her book, we'd be dead. You know it? We all know it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crew. Some nodded firmly, others muttered assent. The first mate's eyes flashed, but he said no more. He rose and stalked away, leaving his stew untouched. For the first time, she realized the truth. Not everyone would welcome her place aboard. Respect and resentment were two sides of the same coin, and the sea had a way of flipping it when least expected. That night, she wrote again, her pen trembling. "They call me navigator now. Some say it with respect, others with anger. I did not ask for this role, but it has found me all the same. The captain trusts me, and some of the crew follow that trust. But one man's pride is dangerous, and pride is louder than fear. I must tread carefully. The sea is not the only storm aboard this ship." She closed the journal, staring out at the horizon. The stars glittered above, clear and sharp. For the first time since she had boarded, she felt the vastness of the ocean, not as isolation, but as possibility. The sea had given her a place, a voice, a name. But she knew deep down that names came with cost. And as the ship cut eastward, its sails catching the wind once more, she wondered if the greatest storm was still ahead, not in the sky, but among those who sailed beside her. The harbor came into view at dawn. After weeks of storms, hunger, and silence, the jagged outline of land broke the horizon, its cliffs glowing gold beneath the rising sun. The crew, weary to their bones, stood along the railings in hushed awe. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers of thanks. For many, the sight of land meant more than safety. It meant survival against odds they had believed impossible. She stood among them, her journal pressed against her chest, the leather still warped from salt and rain. She had filled nearly every page now, each line etched with trembling ink that told not only of tides and winds, but of men, storms, fear, and courage. Looking at the harbor ahead, she felt as though her own journey was written there in stone. The men no longer mocked her. Some nodded respectfully when she passed, others gave small smiles. None dared jest. The title of navigator had taken root, and though it had begun as a whisper, it now carried the weight of truth. Even so, respect came not without tension. The first mate's silence had grown heavier by the day. He spoke only when duty demanded, his jaw tight whenever the captain sought her counsel. Pride, she knew, was a dangerous thing at sea. And though storms of wind and water could sink a ship, storms of pride could tear it apart from within. But as the land grew closer, even his silence bent under the relief of survival. For the first time since the storm, the entire crew seemed united by a single thought. They had lived to see home. The harbor welcomed them with the smell of smoke and fish, gulls crying overhead, and the bustle of merchants on the docks. Children pointed at the battered ship. Women shaded their eyes, and dockhands shouted to one another as they prepared lines to catch the vessel. As the crew tied off ropes and lowered sails, Captain Thorne stood tall at the helm. His eyes swept across his men, then to her. For a moment he said nothing, but in the silence there was more weight than any command he had given. When the ship finally moored, the crew erupted in motion, some rushing down the gangplank, others calling for ale, still others collapsing where they stood, content simply to feel solid ground beneath them. She lingered, her journal tucked beneath her arm, watching it all with a mixture of relief and unease. The voyage had ended, but her story within it had not. That evening, as the men celebrated in taverns and the harbor bustled with trade, she sat alone at the edge of the docks. The journal lay open on her lap, the salty breeze flipping its pages. She dipped her pen, the ink catching the glow of lantern light, and began to write her final entry of the voyage. We have reached land. The sea has released us, though not without cost. The men are changed. They laugh less, but when they do, it is fuller. They look at me not as they once did. They call me navigator now, though I never sought the name. The captain trusts me, and some of the men follow that trust. Others do not. Perhaps they never will. But the sea has spoken, and I have listened. That is enough. She paused, listening to the waves against the pier. The sea was quieter here, gentle, almost kind. Yet she knew it was never truly tamed. I wonder what will become of these words when I am gone. Will they matter? Or will they rot like driftwood, forgotten by all but the sea? I cannot say, but I will keep writing. For as long as the sea whispers, I will listen. She closed the book gently, her hand lingering on the cover. Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned to see Captain Thorne, his coat drawn tight against the wind, his expression as unreadable as ever. He stopped beside her, gazing out at the dark horizon. You write even when the voyage is done, he said, not as a question, but as a statement. She nodded. The sea doesn't stop speaking when the anchor drops. He gave a small grunt of approval, then looked down at the journal. You'll keep it? Always, she said. He was quiet for a long while, then spoke again. One day, perhaps others will read it. And when they do, they'll know what I know, that the sea has many voices, but few who can hear it. You've given it words. Don't let them be lost. She looked up at him, startled by the weight of his tone. You think they matter? His eyes, sharp and steady, met hers. They save lives. That's more than most words ever do. He turned to leave, his boots echoing on the wooden dock. But before he vanished into the night, he paused. You've earned your place, he said quietly. Don't ever doubt it again. And then he was gone. She sat for a long while after, her heart heavy with emotions she could not name. Pride, fear, hope, they mingled together like the tide against the shore. The crew would sail again, of that she was certain. Perhaps on this ship, perhaps another. Storms would come, laughter would return, pride would clash against humility. But she had her journal, and with it the sea's voice. And whether they laughed or listened, she would write. Because that was what she had always done. Weeks later, when the ship was repaired and ready for its next voyage, whispers of her story had already spread. In taverns, men spoke of a woman whose words had steered them through the worst storm of their lives. Some dismissed it as superstition, others swore it as gospel. But the truth lived in her pages, ink pressed into waterlogged paper, waiting for anyone who dared to read. The crew never laughed again when she opened her journal. Instead, they leaned closer, listening. Some out of faith, some out of fear, but all with respect. And Captain Thorne, though still a man of few words, kept her journal close whenever the sea grew restless. On their next departure, as the ship slipped once more into open waters, she stood at the stern, the wind tugging at her hair. She opened her journal, dipped her pen, and began to write anew. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, vast and unknowable, and her heart beat with the certainty that its story was not finished. It never would be.